Shadows over California. The morning fog rolled through the San Fernando Valley like a grey shroud, clinging to the orange groves and modest bungalows that dotted the California landscape. It was October 1924, and in one such house on Magnolia Avenue, Margaret Sullivan stood at her kitchen window, watching the mist swirl while her coffee grew cold in her hands. She coughed, a harsh, rattling sound that had become as familiar as the ticking of the mantel clock. The Spanish flu had left its mark on her lungs 5 years prior, and though she had survived when so many hadn't, each breath reminded her of that narrow escape from death. The doctors had been frank with her during her last visit, though she hadn't shared their prognosis with her family. 6 months, perhaps a year if she was fortunate. She touched the window glass, feeling its coolness against her palm, and wondered if she'd see another California spring. "Still at that window, Maggie?" Her husband Frank's voice cut through the morning quiet. He stood in the doorway, already dressed for his shift at the Pacific Canning Company, his face bearing the permanent scowl that had deepened over their 18 years of marriage. His broad shoulders, once proud and straight, now slumped under the weight of unfulfilled dreams and daily disappointments. "Just watching the sunrise," Margaret replied softly, not turning around. She had learned that direct eye contact often sparked his temper, especially before he'd had his morning coffee. The man she'd married had been different, full of hope and ambition, ready to conquer the world. The war had changed him, as it had changed so many. He'd returned from France with medals and nightmares, trading his uniform for factory overalls and his dreams for bitter reality. Their son Eddie appeared behind his father, 17 years old with his mother's gentle eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. He squeezed past Frank without a word, crossing to kiss his mother's cheek. He was tall for his age, having shot up 3 inches over the summer, and Margaret had to look up now to meet his eyes. "Morning, Ma. How are you feeling?" "Better today," she lied, suppressing another cough. She smoothed his dark hair with one hand, noting how he'd tried to tame it with pomade. "You're up early. Meeting Grace before school." Eddie's face brightened at the mention of his sweetheart. "Her father finally agreed to let me walk her to class." Frank snorted from the doorway. "Pemberton only agreed because he pities you. Man like that doesn't want his daughter mixed up with factory trash." The brightness in Eddie's face dimmed. Margaret placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder. She could feel the tension in his muscles, the way he fought to control his own temper. So like his father in that way. "Frank, please. Don't Frank please me." He stalked to the coffee pot, his heavy boots making the floorboards creak. The kitchen, small as it was, seemed to shrink further with his presence. "Boy needs to know his place. All this mooning over the banker's daughter won't change what we are." "Grace loves me," Eddie said quietly, his hands clenching at his sides. "Money doesn't matter to her." His father's laugh was bitter as the coffee he poured. "Everything matters when it comes to money, boy. Everything. You think love puts food on the table? Pays the rent? Keeps the lights on?" He gestured around the modest kitchen with its cracked linoleum and faded wallpaper. "This is what love without money looks like." Margaret watched the familiar storm brewing between father and son. She moved between them, a practiced peacekeeper. "Eddie, you'd better go if you're meeting Grace. Don't be late." Eddie hesitated, looking between his parents. She could see the war in his eyes, loyalty to her, resentment toward his father, and something else. Hope perhaps, the dangerous kind that could lead to heartbreak. Finally, he grabbed his school bag and headed for the door. "See you tonight, Ma." When the door closed behind him, Frank turned his anger on Margaret. "You coddle that boy. Fill his head with dreams we can't afford. He deserves to dream, Frank. He's young. I was young once too." Frank's voice dropped to a growl. "Look where dreams got me. 16 hours a day in that hellhole, coming home stinking of fish and tomatoes. While men like Pemberton sit in their offices counting money they never earned." Margaret knew better than to argue when he got like this. She moved to the stove, beginning breakfast. The familiar motions, cracking eggs, buttering toast, helped steady her hands. She thought of the pills hidden in her dresser drawer, the ones that helped with the pain but made her so drowsy. Not yet. She needed to stay clear-headed for her family. "The mine closes at 4 today," Frank said suddenly. "Johnson told me about a card game in the back room at Murphy's. Might make some extra cash." "Frank, we can't afford." The sound of his fist hitting the table made her flinch. The sugar bowl jumped, spilling white crystals across the worn wood. "Don't tell me what we can afford. Maybe if you could work instead of standing at windows all day, coughing your lungs out." He stopped abruptly, perhaps seeing the hurt flash across her face. But Frank Sullivan had never been one for apologies. He grabbed his lunch pail and headed for the door. "Don't wait up." The door slammed behind him, rattling the pictures on the wall. Margaret stood alone in the kitchen, one hand pressed to her chest as another coughing fit threatened. She glanced at the photograph on the mantel. Their wedding portrait, taken 18 years ago when Frank's eyes still held warmth and her cheeks bloomed with health. They'd been married at St. Joseph's, with her whole family in attendance. Now most of them were gone, claimed by the flu or scattered across the country seeking work. Outside, the fog was lifting, revealing another day in paradise. But inside the Sullivan house, shadows were gathering. The Pacific Canning Company sprawled along the waterfront like a great metal beast, its smokestacks belching black clouds into the California sky. Frank Sullivan had worked there for 7 years, ever since the munitions factory closed after the war. The work was hard, the hours long, and the pay barely enough to keep a family fed and housed. But it was work, which was more than many men had in 1924. Frank stood at his station on the production line, his hands moving automatically as he sorted tomatoes. Good ones to the left, damaged ones to the right. 8 hours of this, then 4 more at the fish packing station. His back ached, his hands were permanently stained, and the smell of rotting produce had seeped so deep into his skin that no amount of scrubbing could remove it. Sullivan, the floor supervisor, a rat-faced man named Garrett, appeared at his elbow. "You're dropping behind. Pick up the pace." Frank gritted his teeth, but said nothing. Garrett was Pemberton's nephew, given the job through family connections despite having no experience. The irony wasn't lost on Frank. Here he was, taking orders from a boy half his age whose only qualification was his last name. During the lunch break, Frank sat with the other men, picking at his sandwich while they talked about the usual topics: baseball, bootleggers, and the rising cost of everything. "Heard Pemberton's buying another factory," Johnson said, unwrapping his own meager lunch. "Man's got more money than God." "Must be nice," muttered Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who worked the fish line. "My Maria's been sick for weeks. Can't afford a real doctor." Frank thought of Margaret, of her worsening cough, and the bills piling up on the kitchen table. The company insurance was a joke. It would barely cover a funeral, let alone real medical care. But her life insurance, that was different. $50,000. He'd taken out the policy years ago, when times were better and the premiums seemed manageable. Now it hung over them like a promise or a curse, depending on how you looked at it. "You all right, Sullivan?" Johnson asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Frank shook his head. "Just tired." But as he returned to his station, the number kept rolling through his mind. $50,000. Enough to change everything. Enough to give Eddie a real chance at life. Enough to buy respectability, education, a future. All it would cost was Margaret. The thought horrified him, and he pushed it away. But like a splinter working its way deeper into flesh, it kept returning, each time with less revulsion and more cold calculation. That evening, Eddie returned home to find his mother in the parlor, her sewing basket beside her as she mended one of Frank's work shirts. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, highlighting the silver threads in her brown hair. She looked fragile in the golden light, like something made of spun glass that might shatter at a touch. "How was school?" she asked, not looking up from her work. Eddie collapsed into the armchair across from her. The chair had been his grandfather's, brought from Ireland decades ago. Its leather was cracked now, stuffing peeking through in places, but it was still the most comfortable seat in the house. "Fine. Mr. Morrison says I've got a real talent for mathematics. He thinks I could get into college, maybe even with a scholarship." Margaret's needle paused. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Pa won't like it. Your father, he just worries about money. Always has." She resumed her sewing, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency, despite the slight tremor that had developed recently. "But don't let that stop you from trying." Eddie watched his mother work, noting the slight tremor in her hands, the way she had to pause every few minutes to catch her breath. The guilt that had been gnawing at him all day grew stronger. He'd seen her hide the bloody handkerchief that morning, seen the way she gripped the table when the coughing fits were at their worst. "Ma, I need to tell you something." She looked up then, concern creasing her brow. "What is it?" "It's about Grace. Her father, he talked to me today, said if I really loved his daughter, I'd want better for her than what I could provide. He offered to help me get into Stanford, pay for everything, but only if I agreed to stop seeing Grace until after graduation." Margaret set down her sewing. "Oh, Eddie. I didn't know what to say. I love her, Ma, but maybe he's right. Maybe I'm just holding her back." His mother crossed to him, kneeling beside his chair despite the pain it must have caused her weak lungs. She took his hands in hers. They were smaller than his now, he noticed. When had that happened? Listen to me. Love isn't about money or social standing. It's about two people choosing each other, again and again, through whatever life throws at them. Her voice grew distant. Your father and I, we had that once. Before the war, before the factory, before. She stopped, shaking her head. Don't let anyone tell you your love isn't enough. But what if it really isn't? What if all I can offer her is a life like? He gestured around the shabby room, with its threadbare rugs and water-stained ceiling. Like mine. Margaret finished gently. Is that what you were going to say? Eddie flushed. I didn't mean. I know what you meant. She cupped his face in her hands. And you're wrong. This life, difficult as it's been, gave me you. That's worth more than all the money in the world. The front door banged open, making them both jump. Frank stood there, swaying slightly, the smell of bootleg whiskey preceding him into the room. His face was flushed, his eyes bright with alcohol and something else, a kind of desperate energy that made Margaret's heart sink. Talking about love, are we? His words were slurred, venomous. That's rich, coming from you. Margaret rose stiffly. Frank, you're drunk. Observant as always, my dear wife. He stumbled into the room, his eyes fixing on Eddie. Let me tell you about love, boy. Love is what traps you. Makes you weak. Makes you poor. Pa, stop. You think that Pemberton girl loves you? Frank laughed harshly. She loves the idea of rebelling against Daddy. Soon as she gets bored, she'll run back to her mansion and her tea parties, and you'll be left with nothing but a broken heart and empty pockets. Eddie stood, fists clenched. You don't know her. I know enough. Frank's bloodshot eyes narrowed. I know her father has a million reasons why she'll never marry you. And every one of those reasons has a dollar sign in front of it. Money isn't everything. Eddie shouted. No. Frank turned to Margaret, his smile cruel. Tell that to your mother. Tell her money doesn't matter when she's coughing up blood, because we can't afford a real doctor. Tell her money doesn't matter when she drops dead one day and leaves us with nothing but funeral bills. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Frank. But he wasn't done. His rage, fueled by alcohol and years of disappointment, poured out like poison. You know what would solve all our problems? If your precious mother here had the decency to die already. At least then we'd get the insurance money. $50,000. Enough to get us out of this hellhole. Enough to make the Pembertons sit up and take notice. The silence that followed was deafening. Eddie looked at his father with a mixture of shock and disgust. Margaret stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean, Frank started, but the damage was done. Get out, Margaret whispered. Maggie, get out. She screamed, the effort triggering a coughing fit that brought her to her knees. Eddie rushed to his mother's side as Frank stumbled back out into the night. Between them, unspoken but suddenly real, hung the terrible seed of an idea. The following weeks passed in tense silence. Frank slept on the sofa when he came home at all, spending most nights at Murphy's speakeasy or passed out in the factory break room. Eddie devoted himself to caring for his mother, whose health seemed to deteriorate daily. The coughing fits grew more frequent, more violent. Blood appeared more often on her handkerchiefs, though she tried to hide it. The pills from the doctor helped with the pain, but left her drowsy and confused. Carl Morrison noticed the change in his star pupil. Eddie, usually attentive and eager, now sat through classes with hollow eyes, his mind clearly elsewhere. Eddie, a word? Morrison called as the other students filed out one afternoon. Eddie approached the desk reluctantly. Morrison was more than just a teacher to him. He was a mentor, someone who believed in Eddie's potential when few others did. Is everything all right at home? Morrison asked gently. Fine, sir. Eddie. Morrison removed his glasses, cleaning them carefully. I've known your family for years. I can see something's troubling you. For a moment, Eddie wanted to confess everything. His mother's worsening condition, his father's drunken ravings, the terrible thoughts that kept him awake at night. But he couldn't. The words stuck in his throat like stones. Just worried about Ma, he finally managed. Morrison nodded sympathetically. If you need anything, someone to talk to, help with anything, you know where to find me. That afternoon, Eddie found Grace waiting for him outside school. She was a vision in her blue dress, her golden hair catching the California sun. But her beauty only made him more aware of the gulf between them. Her clothes were new, fashionable, while his were carefully mended hand-me-downs. Eddie. She ran to him, then stopped, seeing his expression. What's wrong? Your father talked to me again today. Grace's face fell. Oh, He's right, you know. About us. About me not being good enough. Stop. She gripped his hands fiercely. Don't you dare say that. I love you, Eddie Sullivan. I don't care what my father thinks. But what kind of life can I give you? Look at me, Grace. Look at what I come from. I am looking, she said softly. And I see the boy who helps me with my math homework, who reads poetry with me by the river, who makes me laugh when the world feels too serious. That's all I need. They walked together toward the park, their usual meeting place. The November air was crisp, unusual for California, and Grace shivered. Eddie draped his jacket over her shoulders without thinking, an automatic gesture of care. Tell me what's really wrong, she said as they sat on their favorite bench. Eddie stared at the pond where ducks paddled in lazy circles. Mo's getting worse. The doctors, they don't say it directly, but I can tell they've given up hope. Oh, Eddie. I'm so sorry. And Pa. He trailed off, unable to voice the terrible things his father had said, the awful idea that had taken root in his mind like a poisonous weed. Grace squeezed his hand. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. I promise. But even as she said it, Eddie wondered if some things were too terrible to share, too dark to bring into the light of her perfect world. It was on a particularly bad night, as Margaret struggled for breath between violent coughing fits, that Eddie found his father in the kitchen, stone-cold sober for once, staring at a piece of paper. The kitchen was dimly lit by a single bulb, casting harsh shadows across Frank's face. He looked older than his 42 years, with deep lines etched by disappointment and hard labor. What's that? Eddie asked, exhausted from a sleepless night tending to his mother. Frank looked up, his eyes strangely bright. Insurance policy. Your mother's. Pa. $50,000, Eddie. 50,000. He spread the paper on the table between them. Do you know what we could do with that kind of money? Get you into any college you want. By respectability. Hell, by Grace's father's approval. Eddie felt a chill run down his spine. What are you saying? Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Your mother's dying anyway. The doctor said so himself. Her lungs are shot. 6 months, maybe a year at most. She's in pain, Eddie. Terrible pain. You're talking about... Eddie couldn't say the word. Mercy, Frank finished. I'm talking about mercy. For her and for us. Eddie stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. You're insane. Am I? Frank's voice remained eerily calm. Think about it. She goes peacefully, in her sleep. No more pain. And we get a chance at a real life. You could marry Grace. Have everything I never could give you. Ma would never want this. Your mother wants you to be happy. She told me so herself before. Frank's voice caught. For a moment, Eddie saw a flicker of the man his father used to be. She made me promise to take care of you. This is how I keep that promise. Eddie backed toward the door. I won't let you hurt her. I'm not going to hurt her. Frank pulled a small bottle from his pocket. Laudanum. Doctor prescribed it for her pain. Just a little extra in her evening tea. She'll drift off to sleep and never wake up. Peaceful. Painless. Murder, Eddie said flatly. Liberation, Frank countered. For all of us. That night, Eddie lay awake, his father's words echoing in his mind. From the next room, he could hear his mother's labored breathing, punctuated by occasional moans of pain. He thought of Grace, of their stolen moments together, of a future that seemed impossibly out of reach. He thought of $50,000. He thought of Stanford, of a degree, of a life where he could provide for Grace properly. He thought of his mother, wasting away day by day, each breath a struggle, each moment an agony. By morning, he had made his decision. Not for the money, he told himself. For mercy. For love. For a chance at happiness that his mother would want him to have. He found his father at the kitchen table, that same strange brightness in his eyes. When? Eddie asked quietly. Frank's smile was grim. Tonight. After her evening tea. How do we make sure no one suspects? I've thought of that. Frank's voice was businesslike now, as if they were discussing a factory production schedule. She takes the laudanum every night anyway. We just increase the dose. The doctor won't question it. He knows how much pain she's been in. Natural causes. Respiratory failure. Just like he's been predicting. Eddie nodded mechanically, his mind already compartmentalizing, pushing down the voice that screamed this was wrong. And after? We wait. Let the insurance company do their investigation. They always do with payouts this large. We grieve like proper family. Then, when the money comes... Frank's eyes gleamed. Then we start our new lives. October 31st, 1924. Halloween. The irony wasn't lost on Eddie, as he watched his mother prepare for bed. She seemed better today, more herself, humming softly as she brushed her hair at the vanity. The mirror reflected her face back at him, still beautiful despite the illness that had ravaged her body. "You're cheerful tonight," he observed, his voice carefully neutral. Margaret smiled at him in the mirror. "I had a good day. Mrs. Henderson came by with her new baby. Such a sweet little thing." She turned to face him. "It made me think about when you were small. How you used to toddle after me everywhere, calling Mama, Mama, in that precious voice." Eddie's throat tightened. "Ma, I know I haven't been the mother you deserved lately. All this sickness." She sighed. "But I want you to know how proud I am of you. How much I love you. I love you too, Ma." She held out her arms, and he went to her, kneeling beside her chair as he had as a child. She stroked his hair, humming that old lullaby she used to sing, an Irish melody her own mother had taught her. "Eddie, promise me something. Anything. Be happy. Whatever happens, whatever choices you make, choose happiness. Don't let bitterness poison you like it has your father." He couldn't speak, could only nod against her shoulder. She smelled of lavender and soap, familiar and comforting. "Good boy." She kissed the top of his head. "Now, would you make me some tea before bed? My throat's a bit scratchy." Eddie stood on shaking legs. "Of course, Ma." In the kitchen, Frank waited. The bottle of laudanum sat on the counter, its amber liquid catching the light. Father and son looked at each other across the small space. "Second thoughts?" Frank asked. Eddie's hand trembled as he reached for the kettle. "No. Good. Remember, just a few extra drops. She won't taste it with the honey." As Eddie prepared the tea, measuring the medicine with terrible precision, neither man noticed the shadow at the back door. Carl Morrison had stopped by to drop off a book he'd promised to lend the boy, a mathematics text that might help with his college applications. Finding the back door ajar, he'd raised his hand to knock when he heard their voices. What he saw through the crack in the door froze his blood. Morrison watched as Eddie added drops from the bottle, far more than any prescription would call for. He saw Frank's encouraging nod, heard him whisper, "That's it. Just like we discussed." The teacher backed away slowly, his mind racing. Should he intervene? Call the police? By the time he reached his own back door, he had decided to wait, to watch. Perhaps he had misunderstood. Perhaps it was innocent. But he would be ready. Back in the Sullivan house, Eddie carried the tea tray to his mother's room, each step feeling like a mile. The hallway seemed to stretch impossibly long, the floorboards creaking under his feet like accusations. Margaret was already in bed, propped up on pillows, her Bible open on her lap. "Thank you, sweetheart." She accepted the cup with both hands. "Won't you sit with me a while?" Eddie perched on the edge of the bed, watching as she lifted the cup to her lips. Time seemed to slow. He could stop this. He could knock the cup from her hands, confess everything, save her. But then what? More suffering? More poverty? More watching her waste away day by day? Margaret took a sip, then another. "Perfect. You always did make the best tea." They sat in comfortable silence as she drank. Eddie found himself memorizing every detail of her face. The laugh lines around her eyes, the grey streaks in her hair, the gentle curve of her smile. This was his mother, the woman who had sung him to sleep, bandaged his scraped knees, defended him against his father's rage. And he was killing her. "I'm feeling very sleepy all of a sudden," she murmured, setting down the empty cup. That's good, Ma. You need your rest." She settled back against the pillows, her eyes already growing heavy. "Will you stay until I fall asleep?" "Of course." "And Eddie?" Her voice was fading. "Remember what I said. Choose happiness." "I will, Ma. I promise." She smiled one last time, then closed her eyes. Her breathing gradually slowed, deepened. Eddie held her hand, feeling her pulse flutter and fade beneath his fingers. The room grew quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the nightstand. "Ma," he whispered. No response. "Ma." The door burst open. Frank stood there, wild-eyed. "Is it done?" Eddie couldn't speak. He was still holding his mother's hand, still waiting for her to open her eyes and smile at him again. Frank crossed to the bed, checking for a pulse at her neck. His face went pale. "She's gone. I killed her." The words came out in a broken whisper. "I killed my mother." "No." Frank gripped his shoulders. "She was dying anyway. We gave her peace. Remember that." But Eddie wasn't listening. He was staring at his mother's face, so serene in death, and seeing only the trust in her eyes as she drank the poisoned tea. From his house next door, Carl Morrison watched the Sullivan windows. He saw the lights go on and off, saw shadows moving behind curtains. He reached for his telephone, then hesitated. What would he say? That he thought he'd seen something suspicious? That he had suspicions based on a glimpse through a cracked door? He decided to wait until morning. But he would watch. And he would remember. The funeral was a modest affair. Margaret Sullivan was laid to rest in the Glendale Cemetery on a grey November morning, the fog once again shrouding the valley like a burial cloth. The small Episcopal church was half full. Factory workers, neighbours, a few members of Margaret's sewing circle. Grace Pemberton stood beside Eddie, her black dress a stark contrast to her pale skin. The minister spoke of Margaret's kindness, her devotion to her family, her strength in the face of illness. Eddie barely heard the words. He stood between his father and Grace, feeling like a stranger in his own skin. Every condolence felt like an accusation, every sympathetic look a judgment. "I'm so sorry," Grace whispered, squeezing his hand. "I know how much you loved her." Eddie couldn't meet her eyes. If she knew what he'd done, she'd recoil from his touch. He accepted her comfort like a thief, knowing he deserved none of it. After the service, as mourners dispersed, Carl Morrison approached. The teacher's face was grave, his usual warmth replaced by something harder. "Eddie, Mr. Sullivan, my condolences." "Thank you," Frank replied stiffly. Morrison's eyes lingered on Eddie. Such a sudden passing. She seemed to be improving just last week. "These things happen," Frank said. Her lungs were weak. "Indeed." Morrison adjusted his glasses. "Still, one can't help but wonder. I happened to pass by your house that night, Halloween. Thought I might drop off a book for Eddie." Eddie felt the blood drain from his face. Frank's hand tightened on his shoulder. "Did you?" Frank's voice was carefully neutral. "I did." Morrison's gaze never wavered. "But it was late. I didn't want to disturb you." The three men stood in weighted silence. Other mourners drifted past, offering condolences, but Morrison didn't move. Finally, he tipped his hat. "Well, do let me know if there's anything you need, Eddie. Anything at all." After he left, Frank turned to his son. "He knows. He can't prove anything," Eddie said mechanically. "Doesn't matter. Suspicion is enough in a town like this." They were right. Within days, whispers began to circulate. Mrs. Henderson mentioned to her sister that Margaret had seemed perfectly healthy when she visited. The pharmacist noted that Frank had been purchasing more laudanum than usual. Morrison, while never directly accusing anyone, made vague comments about unnatural deaths and guilty consciences. The insurance company sent an investigator. A thin, hawk-faced man named Peterson who asked probing questions and took copious notes. He interviewed neighbors, doctors, even the mortician. He spent hours at the Sullivan house, examining medicine bottles, reviewing medical records, asking the same questions in different ways. "Standard procedure," he assured Frank. "With a payout this large, we have to be thorough." But his eyes said otherwise. They were cold, calculating, seeing through facades to the guilt beneath. Frank grew increasingly paranoid. He stopped going to Murphy's, stopped talking to neighbors. He paced the house at night, checking and rechecking locks, starting at every sound. Eddie withdrew into himself, going through the motions of daily life like an automaton. He attended school but learned nothing. He met Grace but could barely look at her. "What's wrong?" she asked one afternoon as they sat by their pond. "You've been so distant since I murdered my mother," Eddie wanted to say. Instead, he mumbled something about grief, about needing time. Grace was patient, understanding. She held his hand and talked about their future, about the life they'd build together. Every word was a knife in Eddie's heart. As November wore on, the Sullivan house took on an oppressive atmosphere. Father and son moved through the rooms like ghosts, avoiding each other's gaze, starting at every creak and shadow. It began with small things. Eddie would catch a whiff of his mother's lavender perfume in empty rooms. Frank heard her humming in the kitchen late at night. They both found her hairbrush moved from where they'd left it, her Bible open to different passages each morning. "Houses settle," Frank muttered, but his hands shook as he poured his whiskey. One night, Eddie woke to find his mother's rocking chair moving gently back and forth, as if someone had just risen from it. Another time, Frank discovered the kitchen table set for 3, though he'd cleared it himself before bed. They didn't discuss these occurrences. To acknowledge them would be to acknowledge what they'd done. Then came the night of November 30th, exactly 1 month after Margaret's death. Eddie woke to the sound of coughing. Not his own, the deep, rattling cough that had haunted their home for months. He lay frozen in bed, listening as it moved down the hallway, pausing outside his door. "Ma," he whispered. The coughing stopped. In the sudden silence, he heard something far worse. The soft rustle of fabric, like a nightgown brushing against the floor. His doorknob turned slowly. Eddie squeezed his eyes shut, pulling the covers over his head like a child. The door creaked open. Footsteps crossed the floor, stopping beside his bed. He felt the mattress dip as someone sat down. Eddie. His mother's voice, but wrong somehow. Hollow. Cold. Eddie, look at me. He couldn't. Wouldn't. A hand touched his shoulder through the blanket. Icy cold, even through the fabric. My sweet boy. My murderer. Eddie screamed, throwing off the covers and scrambling for the light switch. The room flooded with brightness, revealing nothing. An empty room. An undisturbed bed. But the smell of lavender lingered, and on his shoulder, the fabric showed the clear print of a hand. Frank burst through the door, wild-eyed. What happened? She was here, Eddie gasped. Ma was here. That's impossible. She's dead. We made sure of that. The words hung between them, an admission of guilt that made the room feel colder. That night, they sat in the kitchen, every light in the house blazing. Neither could sleep. Neither wanted to be alone. It's our imagination, Frank insisted. Guilt playing tricks on us. But even as he said it, they heard footsteps upstairs, slow, measured steps in Margaret's room. The rocking chair creaked. A woman's voice hummed an Irish lullaby. Frank fared no better in the following nights. He took to sleeping with every light in the house blazing, a bottle of whiskey always within reach. But alcohol couldn't drown out the voices. Frank. Margaret's whisper would float through the rooms, sometimes pleading, sometimes accusing. Frank, why? He'd stumble through the house, following the voice, only to find empty rooms and his own reflection staring back from darkened windows. One night, driven to near madness, he shouted at the darkness. You were dying anyway. It was mercy. The house fell silent. Then, from directly behind him. Was it mercy, Frank? Or was it murder? He spun around to find Margaret standing there, still in her funeral dress, her face pale as moonlight. She looked exactly as she had in life, except for her eyes, black holes that seemed to pull in all the light. Maggie, $50,000, she continued, moving closer. That's what I was worth to you. $50,000. No. I loved you. You loved money more. She reached for him, and Frank felt ice enter his veins. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as her cold fingers traced the lines of his face. I forgive you, Frank, she whispered. But can you forgive yourself? She showed him visions then, their wedding day, when he'd promised to love and cherish her. The birth of Eddie, when they'd been so full of hope. The quiet evenings before the war, when happiness didn't require money. And then the darker images, him planning her death, counting future dollars while she struggled to breathe, the cold calculation in his eyes as he watched Eddie prepare the fatal tea. I gave you everything, she said softly. My youth, my health, my love. And you repaid me with poison. Frank fell to his knees. I'm sorry. God, Maggie, I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't bring back the dead, Frank. Sorry doesn't undo murder. When Eddie found him the next morning, Frank was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, his hair gone white overnight. He clutched a photo of their wedding day, tears streaming down his face. Pa. Eddie approached cautiously. Pa, what happened? Frank looked up with haunted eyes. She was here. All night. Showing me things. Making me remember. His voice cracked. Do you know what I realized, Eddie? I didn't kill her for you. I didn't even kill her for the money. I killed her because I was tired of feeling like a failure. I killed her because I blamed her for my misery. Pa. And now she's gone, and the misery is worse than ever. Because now I know what I really am. He laughed bitterly. A murderer. A man who killed the only person who ever truly loved him. The haunting intensified over the next weeks. Margaret appeared to them both regularly now, sometimes separately, sometimes together. She didn't rage or threaten. That wasn't her way. Instead, she reminded them of love squandered, trust betrayed, a life stolen for pieces of silver. The neighbors began to notice. Lights burning all night. Strange sounds. The way both Sullivan men jumped at shadows, spoke to empty rooms. Mrs. Henderson told her husband she'd seen Margaret's silhouette in the window one evening, clear as day. The postman swore he'd heard her voice calling from inside the house. Even Carl Morrison, rational man that he was, felt uneasy when passing the Sullivan house. There was something wrong about it, something that made the hair on his neck stand up. He'd taken to avoiding that street altogether. By December, the insurance company had completed its investigation. Peterson delivered the news personally. Congratulations, Mr. Sullivan. The claim has been approved. $50,000 will be deposited into your account by week's end. The investigator stood in their parlor, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The drawn curtains, the circles under both men's eyes, the way they flinched at sudden movements. Frank accepted the check with trembling hands. That's it? We're cleared. Peterson's smile was thin. Legally, yes. We found no evidence of foul play. Your wife's death has been ruled natural causes. He paused at the door. Though I must say, Mr. Sullivan, in my 20 years of investigating claims, I've learned that legal vindication and moral absolution are two very different things. After he left, Frank and Eddie stood looking at the check. We did it, Frank said hollowly. We're rich. Eddie couldn't respond. The number on the check blurred before his eyes, transforming into his mother's face, her trusting smile as she drank her final cup of tea. That night, the haunting reached its crescendo. Margaret appeared to them both in the parlor, no longer pale and ethereal but vivid, solid, real as she'd been in life. She wore the blue dress Frank had bought her for their 10th anniversary, the one she'd loved so much. My boys, she said sadly. My loves. My murderers. She sat in her old chair by the window, hands folded in her lap. For a moment, it was as if nothing had changed, as if she might ask Eddie about school or remind Frank to wipe his boots. Ma, Eddie whispered. We're sorry. We're so sorry. I know you are. Her voice held infinite sadness. But sorry doesn't change what you've done. Sorry doesn't bring me back. She showed them visions then, not of the past, but of the future. Eddie saw himself years from now, successful perhaps, but alone, haunted, unable to form real connections because of the guilt he carried. He saw relationships crumble, saw himself pushing away anyone who got too close, afraid they'd see the murderer beneath the surface. Frank saw his own future, a man destroyed by his crime, unable to enjoy the money he'd killed for, drinking himself to death in expensive hotels, calling out for a wife who would never answer. The money won't save you, Margaret said. It will destroy you, as it destroyed us. Blood money never brings happiness. What should we do? Frank asked desperately. That's for you to decide. I can't make your choices for you. I never could. She stood, moving toward the door. But remember this, I loved you both. Despite everything, I loved you. And I forgive you. Don't go, Eddie pleaded. Please, Ma, don't leave us. She turned back, and for a moment she was the mother he remembered. Warm, loving, alive. I'm already gone, Eddie. You made sure of that. But I'll always be here. She touched her chest, over her heart. In the guilt you carry. In the memories you treasure. In the love you squandered. And then she was gone, leaving only the scent of lavender and the weight of truth. 3 days later, Carl Morrison heard screaming from the Sullivan house. He and several neighbors rushed over to find Eddie in the front yard, wild-eyed and babbling about ghosts and forgiveness. Inside, they found Frank's body hanging from the ceiling beam, a note clutched in his stiff fingers. I'm sorry, Maggie. I'm so sorry. The money is cursed. Don't let Eddie touch it. Tell him to run. Tell him to forget. Tell him I loved you both, in my broken way. The scandal exploded across the neighborhood. The suspicious death, the insurance money, the suicide. It was too much to be coincidence. The whispers that had been circulating turned to open speculation. Carl Morrison, finally breaking his silence, told the police about what he'd seen that Halloween night. While there wasn't enough evidence to bring charges, the court of public opinion had rendered its verdict. Grace's father forbade her from seeing Eddie. The boy's family is cursed, he declared. Murder and madness run in their blood. Eddie, driven to desperation, convinced Grace to run away with him. We'll start fresh, he promised. Somewhere nobody knows us. What about the money? She asked. Eddie shuddered. I won't touch it. It's blood money. Cursed. They left California on a Greyhound bus 2 weeks before Christmas, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and a love they thought could survive anything. It couldn't. Without money, they quickly learned how cruel the world could be. They found themselves in San Francisco first, Eddie picking up day labor at the docks while Grace took in washing. But the guilt ate at him, manifesting in shaking hands and haunted eyes that scared away employers. He'd wake screaming from nightmares where his mother asked him why, always why. It's not real, Grace would soothe him. It's just your imagination. But Eddie knew better. He could feel his mother's presence, disappointed and sad. She didn't appear to him anymore. Perhaps she knew her message had been delivered, but her absence was almost worse. It left him alone with his guilt, with no possibility of forgiveness or resolution. He started drinking to quiet the voices in his head, his mother's disappointed sighs, his father's bitter laughter. Grace stuck by him at first, but love without hope is a fragile thing. When someone offered her pills that promised to take away the pain, she took them. Just to help me sleep, she said. Just to stop thinking for a while. One pill led to two to 10. Soon they were both lost in a haze of alcohol and opiates, stealing to feed their habits, running from police and creditors, and the ghosts that followed them everywhere. They ended up in the Tenderloin district, living in a derelict building with other lost souls. Eddie barely recognized the girl Grace had become. Thin, hollow-eyed, her golden hair now dull and matted. He knew he looked no better. Sometimes he caught glimpses of himself in store windows and saw his father's face staring back. It was there, on a cold February night in 1925, that their story reached its final chapter. The police raid came without warning. Eddie, high and paranoid, thought the officers were the ghosts coming to claim him at last. He ran, Grace stumbling after him, up the fire escape to the roof. "Stop!" the officers shouted. "There's nowhere to go." But Eddie wasn't listening. He saw his mother standing at the edge of the roof, arms outstretched. She looked as she had before the illness, young, healthy, smiling. "Come to me, my boy," she called. "Come home." For the first time in months, Eddie felt peace. He ran toward her, toward forgiveness, toward absolution. The officers' shots rang out in the night. Eddie fell, not off the building but onto the tar paper roof, blood spreading beneath him like dark wings. Grace crawled to him, cradling his head in her lap. "Eddie! Eddie, stay with me." His eyes found hers, suddenly clear. "Grace, I need to tell you about my mother." And there, as his life ebbed away, Eddie Sullivan confessed. He told her everything. The plot, the poison, the insurance money that still sat untouched in a California bank. He told her about the guilt that had driven his father to suicide and himself to destruction. "She forgives me," he whispered, his gaze fixed on something Grace couldn't see. "She says she forgives us both." He died with a smile on his lips, leaving Grace alone with the terrible truth. The newspapers had a field day with the story. Deathbed confession reveals insurance murder. Cursed money claims another victim. Tragic end to California crime. Grace Pemberton was arrested for theft, drug possession, and a dozen other charges. She sat in her cell, staring at the grey walls, thinking about Eddie's final words. She wrote it all down. Every detail he'd told her, every moment of their doomed flight from justice. She sent the confession to the authorities, to the insurance company, to the newspapers. She wanted the world to know the truth about the Sullivan family tragedy. The insurance money was recovered and donated to a charity for tuberculosis sufferers in Margaret Sullivan's name. The Sullivan house on Magnolia Avenue stood empty for years, earning a reputation as the most haunted house in the valley. Neighbors reported seeing lights in the windows, hearing coughs and cries in the night. Grace served her time in San Quentin, a model prisoner who spent her days in the library, reading mathematics texts, the subject Eddie had loved. She never spoke of him to the other inmates, never shared their story. That burden was hers alone to carry. She died in 1947, alone in her cell, clutching a faded photograph of a young man with gentle eyes and a stubborn jaw. The guards found her with a peaceful expression, as if she'd finally found what she'd been looking for. They said she died whispering a name. Eddie. Years later, when the old Sullivan house was finally demolished to make way for a shopping center, workers found something strange in the walls. Dozens of letters, all addressed to Yes and signed, "Your loving mother." The letters were dated after Margaret Sullivan's death. They spoke of forgiveness, of love that transcends death, of the terrible price of greed and the healing power of truth. They urged Eddie to confess, to seek redemption, to choose happiness over money. The letters were never sent, of course. How could they be? But they existed nonetheless, written in Margaret's careful script, sealed with wax waiting. Some say Margaret Sullivan's spirit wrote them, trying desperately to save her son from beyond the grave. Others claim Eddie wrote them himself in his guilt-induced madness, creating the forgiveness he so desperately craved. The truth, like all truth in this story, remains shrouded in California fog. But on quiet nights, when the mist rolls in from the Pacific and shrouds the valley in grey, old-timers say you can still hear her, Margaret Sullivan, the murdered mother, calling across the years. Choose happiness, not money. Choose love, not greed. Choose truth, not lies. And sometimes, if you listen very carefully, you can hear two voices answering. "We're sorry, Ma. We're so very sorry. I know, my boys. Come home. All is forgiven." The fog swirls, the voices fade, and California dreams on, built on a foundation of gold and ghosts, forever haunted by the price of paradise. In the end, the Sullivan family tragedy became a cautionary tale, whispered in valley parlors and taught in Sunday schools. A reminder that some things cost more than money can ever repay. That love, once betrayed, leaves wounds that never heal. That murder, even when dressed as mercy, carries a price that extends beyond the grave. The insurance company never paid out another claim without the most rigorous investigation. The Pemberton family moved away, unable to bear the association with the scandal. Carl Morrison continued teaching until retirement, but he never forgot that Halloween night, never stopped wondering if he could have prevented tragedy by speaking sooner. And somewhere in the California soil, beneath a simple headstone that reads Margaret Sullivan, beloved wife and mother, a woman rests at last. Not in peace, that was stolen from her, but in the knowledge that truth, like murder, will out. That justice, though delayed, is rarely denied. That love, even betrayed love, endures beyond death, beyond guilt, beyond the reach of mortal greed. The $50,000 that cost 3 lives remains a footnote in history, a number on a ledger, ashes scattered to the wind. But the story of the Sullivans, of Frank's desperate greed, Eddie's misguided mercy, and Margaret's enduring love, lives on, a ghost story for a new age, a reminder that some currencies are too dear to spend. And in the pre-dawn hours, when the California fog is thickest and the world seems caught between night and day, between dream and waking, between life and death, if you stand very still on what was once Magnolia Avenue, you might hear it, the sound of a woman humming an Irish lullaby, of a teacup settling into its saucer, of forgiveness offered across the veil. Listen carefully. The dead have much to teach the living, if only we have the courage to hear. The end.